Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's exciting event with Chris Mills, the news editor of BGR. Chris, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us. And audience members, if you're tuned in to the recording on YouTube, be sure to hit subscribe. So, Chris, we have 45 minutes today, so let's just jump right into it. Can you tell us about yourself and your professional background?
Sure. So I started pretty much with a cold pitch email to the news editor of Gizmodo UK, which at the time was well, it's still up and running. It's a small kind of regional franchise version of the big Gizmodo.com that I think everyone knows. And I worked there as an intern briefly before doing a little freelance, and then I spent a year working as a full-time kind of staff writer there. That was all in London, and then I moved to Canada to go to college. Kept freelancing during that time, mostly using contacts and things I knew from the UK from my time working there. Started working as Gizmodo.com's night editor a few years ago. So I was running the site after hours, after the West Coast team had logged off until kind of small hours of the morning, doing a lot of breaking news, that kind of thing, and also started helping out more and more with the big events. And eventually, nearly 18 months ago now, started working as the news editor of BGR.com, much smaller team, but we're more focused on consumer technology and that kind of thing.
How interesting. And what attracted you to BGR?
It was mostly the challenge of trying to take a small organization, like a really tight team, and just trying to grow the site, especially expanding our coverage from just the very narrow focus on mobile that had been there before, and we're still in the process of trying to build out the scope of our coverage and the quality.
You know, you mentioned you were a night editor trying to just continue with the news cycle at your previous job with Gizmodo, and now you're obviously running news for the entire organization. BGR is America's #1 source of exclusive and breaking mobile news, according to you guys, and a leader among early adopters. Tech media feels quite crowded today. How do you stay ahead of the pack with exclusives and coverage?
It's a whole mix. So some things just being fast is important, obviously. And that's reflected, I think, in our day-to-day coverage and the focus of a lot of our writers. And then I think maintaining good contacts with the industry is really important to getting the whole breadth of coverage that we need. So rather than just writing up a quick press release or a piece of breaking news, if you know the people to contact to get commentary or something, or you know the specific executives or PR people at a particular company who will be able to answer your question the fastest, and especially if you have a pre-existing relationship with them, you can pick up the phone and call them and get that kind of usable information before everyone else. That can go a really long way to getting the kind of in-depth coverage and analysis that makes you stand out.
Okay. Um, Back in May, you guys published a fascinating write-up about an airplane startup, an electric airplane startup actually, based in Washington. What makes a tech startup unique enough to warrant BGR coverage?
Um, it's a really difficult mix, and it's definitely a case-by-case basis. Obviously, the first thing we're looking at is interest, and that can take a lot of forms. If something's going to be relevant to our reader, whether it's going to be changing the world that they live in or something that they deal with specifically, that's obviously of interest. But then these days, especially with the number of startups and ideas coming along, you need to look at whether something's feasible or not. It's all fine to have a great idea or an awesome looking Kickstarter project, but if we don't feel that that's ever going to come to fruition, then we're a lot less likely to cover something. So it's really getting a mix of kind of the angle of interest for our readers, whether something's going to be an important game-changing technology, and then a little bit, as I said, of looking at how feasible that idea is.
So feasibility and interest for your audience. And Chris, Who is your audience? Can you kind of tell us who you look at as your core audience?
Well, if you ask Google Analytics, it would be an 18 to 35 influencer demographic that advertisers like a lot. But I think outside of that, we'd be looking at people who are really interested in staying up to date on uh, new technology before it's even emerged. We do a lot of coverage on rumors and leaks and that kind of thing, especially in the mobile industry. There's a lot of people who are really interested in keeping abreast of that news almost as a hobby. Uh, they're not just interested in influencing their purchasing decisions. They're interested in looking at industry trends, where things are going, what the next big thing is going to be. And that's, I think, a thing that a lot of other sites sometimes start to forget about is that for a lot of people, it's not just about the reviews and which phone is the best. There's a community, it's a hobby, it's an interest, and we cater to a lot of that, I think.
You know, I love your guys' history and that you started as a private column, you know, doing what you're doing now, but on a smaller level with one gentleman. And it's amazing to see you guys spread and grow, but still keep that love of exclusives, rumors, gossip in a positive sense.
Yeah,
Um,
again, there's always the temptation when a site starts getting bigger to kind of grow up and be more traditional in your approach to covering things. Um, and yeah, there's definitely a lot to be said for only reporting things that are based on really good sources. But as I said, lots of people want to hear about other things, even if they're just ideas that really aren't ever going to come to fruition. They just want to know what's going on and what's being talked about.
Audience members, if you have questions for Chris, no worries. Feel free to tweet those in or right here in GoToWebinar. Just ask those questions. We will take them at the end. Chris, you recently wrote a piece about Amazon Music student discount, making the service $5 a month, $5 a month. This was timely with universities and colleges going back in session. Do you rely on an annual or quarterly editorial calendar for your coverage?
We do for some things, but we tend to be, I think, partly as a result of being a smaller team, we, we're a lot more reactionary with a lot of that kind of thing. We don't plan features out regularly many months in advance. And you know, that story, for example, is really just covering a move that Amazon made. Even if we know about that kind of thing a week or two in advance from an embargo or similar, we're not sitting there months in advance trying to plan out 200 or 300 word blog posts about back to school. That just happens with the seasons pretty much.
Your publication's 11th birthday is in October. First of all, congratulations on the upcoming anniversary.
Thank you.
How has BGR evolved since it was founded in 2006?
Well, like you said, it started as a single columnist, only focused on the mobile industry. And I think the thing that reflects the biggest change in our site is the change in the mobile industry. 2006, you're just looking about the launch of the first iPhone. For a starter, it was a lot easier to get exclusive images of first devices. These days, like a big iPhone launch is streamed all over the world. It's a matter of intense interest for the stock market. It's very, very difficult to get any kind of advanced information out of companies these days. Back in 2006, you had devices being handed out to people months in advance of launch just to try and get some kind of buzz going on. So it's really been a big shift in the power dynamic. You've gone from the mobile device companies being the people who are out there actively searching for coverage all day, every day, to they're kind of the gateholders. And it's become a lot more like access journalism in other fields where you have a huge media industry that's very beholden to the whims of a few big companies for some stories. So I think that kind of change shows in the size of sites that are popping up. You have, you know, The Verge now. It started only a few years ago as a startup, and they have one of the biggest editorial teams focused on tech in the world. I think far bigger than anyone could have predicted in 2006.
You know, we had an event with Pete Batchel from Mashable a little while ago, and he mentioned that Mashable, around 2006 as well, actually, had a niche in that they were able to cover the socials. Nobody really cared about the socials, and they were able to come up like that. But similar to what you're saying, that now there's so much coverage, and yet there's gatekeepers. And but how does one stand out today? Just long form being first, providing what in your mind makes just exemplary journalism today?
Um, as I said earlier, I think it's a really interesting mix. You need to have all the news that matters to your readers. You need to have it in a timely fashion, but the stuff on your front page can't look the same as the stuff on everyone else's front page. You need unique voices providing opinion. You need ideally a depth of coverage, going a little further into stories, trying to get an understanding behind something, not just taking a corporate statement at face value, but really digging down. And I think one thing that has shone through my whole career, because I started at Gizmodo, which is famous for kind of, well, Gawker Media would always say speaking truth to power. Um, but it's true that looking at everything skeptically, not just taking things at face value. And I think that's a really important part, especially when you look at the gatekeepers and the access journalism that goes on, is not just saying, you know, the company spokesperson said this, an industry analyst said this, we're going to put the two sides up against each other. A lot of times people want to hear an opinion. They want to hear, this is my best guess about what's going on. This, based on these pieces of knowledge that we have, this is what we think is happening. This is what we think is going to come next. And I think that's one thing that can really help to stand out is forming opinions, showing the work behind them, and really trying to give people a deeper level of understanding than just providing a couple quotes and some context and going from there.
Fair enough. And Chris, what does your team look like as far as full-time members, freelancers, content syndication? You mentioned before this event started that you guys are, you know, not working out of an office and distributed all over North America, but can you walk us through your team?
Yeah, so we're mostly full-time writers. The precise kind of legal definition of where everyone is in terms of salaried versus not, I won't get into, but suffice to say that so I personally live outside the US, so I'm not a full-time salaried employee per se. But we mostly rely on full-time members. We all work remotely under the umbrella of Penske Media Corporation, which is based in New York. So we have the kind of the back-end support of a big company when it comes to things like ad sales, HR, even just having a physical office presence that we can use. But day to day, it feels like working on a much smaller team where only a handful of people in Slack every day working remotely, which is honestly quite nice. It's good to work with a small team and be a lot quicker to implement changes across the site and in covering news as well.
So it sounds like Penske takes a pretty hands-off approach with you guys. It sounds like you have a lot of independence, even though you're, you know, part of their company, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, me personally, I only cover the editorial side of our site, which again is very refreshing for me, especially coming from Gawker Media before, where I left just as there was a lot of legal drama going on. So it's refreshing to come and only focus on providing good editorial content. We don't touch, at least I don't touch advertising or anything else there. It's a good dynamic, I think, that's been set up.
BGR has an interesting piece about the world's first self-driving taxi in Singapore. How much do you guys focus on international news coverage versus what's happening in North America?
We will generally, I think, always focus on stuff in the US, and even when we're touching on other international news, it will quite often be about things that we think is going to impact people in the US. So that example, it's a self-driving taxi. And sure, it's in Singapore, but it's laying the groundwork for something that may well come to the US in the near future. So in that case, the angle, I think, is pretty obvious. Sometimes it can be different. I remember writing a piece for a US audience about the state of, or some changes to the mobile industry in Canada, which is one of my beats in the US. And the angle there was looking at what what the American market and American consumers can learn from looking at changes happening to the Canadian market, which it's just a very interesting thing to be able to look at a market that's so similar in terms of demographics, in terms of population density as well, but then also completely different and not conforming to any of the same regulatory rules as the US. So we will, I think, always be covering US news first. We are primarily a US audience and a US-based team, but we'll reach outside of that when we think it's going to be relevant for people and people will be interested in reading about it.
It's interesting the way you described it. So in other words, obviously covering the US market, but then covering other markets, including Canada, and synthesizing what's going on there and why it's relevant to the US. I think that's good info, audience members. So, and Chris, the global internet penetration last time I checked was 51%, meaning there's still another 3.7 billion people or so coming online over the next 10 to 20 years. What do you think the mobile landscape, well, and just the tech landscape in general, will look like by the time the entire world is online?
I think that's a really interesting space to look at going forwards. One thing to think about is not just that people will come online, but how they'll come online. Net neutrality is always a topic of interest for tech blogs across the country, and I think it's a really good example of a topic that industry watchers think is very important, and I would think is very important, but it's very difficult to explain to people why it's important or why they should care. And net neutrality problems are exacerbated, I think, in third world countries, and in countries where people are just starting to come online because they don't have this societal norm that internet should be open and that access to everything should be unrestricted. That's the way the internet's operated for the last 30 years. And that's why people are fighting so hard to defend it in the US. But if you go to different countries where people don't have internet access, the prospect of a company, say Facebook, sponsoring data access to their platform, and maybe a handful of other sites, doesn't seem foreign, it doesn't seem strange. But obviously it could be creating a very different power, just a very different looking internet down the line. So I think how people come online, who provides that internet service, how it's being paid for, is going to be the really interesting trend to watch. Smartphones are smartphones, and a $150 Android phone now can, in practical terms, do everything that a $1,000 phone can. It'll just do it slower and with less convenience, and the cameras won't be as good and whatever else. But I think the really important thing to look at is how people come online and how that affects the products and services that they use.
You know, Chris, that's a really interesting point, and I had a chance to live in Southeast Asia and parts of the developing world, and the most fascinating thing about those $150 devices that you mentioned, and sometimes even cheaper, is that many times people will simply buy the device, they're on the internet for the first time, and there's not a big celebration as far as they just kind of assume that it's a feature in the phone. In other words, it's almost taken for granted. You're not going through what, other people went through 10, 20 years ago. You're just kind of there and on the internet, not even thinking about these things at first.
Yeah, it's a very different landscape, I think, and trying to, honestly, watching US companies try and approach it, Uber would be, I think, a pretty good example of a US company that tried to take its business model overseas and didn't have great success. So watching US companies approach that problem is definitely a topic of interest for us these days. And that kind of circles back to what you were saying about US coverage versus international coverage when something that's worked in the US is being taken overseas, especially when it's a company that everyone knows, something like Uber, that's another thing we'll always be watching for.
Who are the international competitors? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, international competitors and how a familiar business model can go and work in a different country.
Mm. In a typical week, approximately how many PR pitches are you receiving, you and your colleagues are receiving from publicists?
Um, I can't speak for my colleagues because if we spent all of our time comparing email pitches, we really wouldn't get any work done. But I would say I probably get an average of 50 to 75 pitches per day. So you can be looking at about 300 a week, I would guess. Of that, I honestly don't know how many of those are duplicates or follow-ups. I just know that sorting through my email inbox is a constant thing, and I have very briefly worked in the PR industry, so I understand the different dynamics at play. Quite often it isn't people's own decision whether they're going to send a follow-up pitching email or even a phone call. But I also don't have a perfect way to make a pitch stand out other than to say reading the site is probably the #1 best thing, and building a relationship with the journalist. So quite often that can mean not following up when it's a bad pitch, or not a bad pitch, but something that you don't think is going to be particularly relevant, and really keeping abreast of the media so that you can understand individually who covers different topics. So for example, I cover the wireless BGR. I'm covering all the carriers and everything related to that, really. So I'm, me personally, 5 times more likely to look at a survey about mobile internet data usage trends than my colleagues. That would seem quite arcane to them, but I spend more time looking at it. So even if I can't use it for a standalone article, I'm going to read it and quite possibly include that in some article or something later down the line. So yeah, it's difficult. I mean, it's the #1 question I think that I always get from PRs is what's the best way to contact you or to send you a pitch? And the best way is to do as many things passively as you can to understand before even sending it if it's going to be of interest. And then building up a relationship long term is obviously a big help.
At the beginning of this event, you mentioned something along the lines of one of the ways to get ahead or get in depth is to leverage certain relationships with PRs at maybe bigger companies or, you know, very serious players. How can PR, you know, in the spirit of that, in the spirit of building those relationships that you mentioned, how can PR professionals be most helpful to you other than providing certain data?
This data, I would also say I've had a few people from agencies reach out to say, this is my current list of clients. In some cases, these are the particular people working at companies who don't just have a background being a CFO in something, but they have a background being an industry analyst or something like that, and giving me an idea of who they can connect me with quickly, because as I mentioned before, quite often we're working on really tight deadlines, and there isn't a full day to go back and forth to arrange an interview time or something. Putting me in contact with someone quickly and someone who I know is going to be good and going to be able to provide insight can go a really long way to getting your client coverage.
Fair enough. And audience members, if you have any questions, just submit those. We'll be sure to take them at the end. And Chris, BGR has a deals section. What makes a deal unique enough or special enough to warrant being in there?
It's that old thing of things that we think are going to be of interest to our readers. So obviously we can look at the traffic for deals posts. We can get a really good idea of what people are clicking on, what they're not, what they're clicking through to, and what they're not. And that kind of feeds our understanding. If you want to know what people are interested in buying, I would always say the best thing to do is go look at the Wirecutter, who they publish a list of their most used guides at any one time. So that's a pretty good place to start if you want to know what people are quite often Googling to find a deal on or to find advice, buying advice on. Um, Other than that, our deals stuff is handled a little differently of editorial. It's not put together normally by the same people as our editorial team, so the precise details on that, I don't really deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. And we have a question about your socials and Twitter specifically, if sort of what your guys' social strategy is. Is it just putting up everything you're posting, or what's your take on your socials as a media organization?
It really depends which platform you're looking at, and I think treating them all differently and looking at how content spreads across different platforms is the key to understanding that. So straight news headlines normally work the best on Twitter, quite often with a particular image, something like that, whereas headlines work very differently on Facebook in terms of what spreads. But it's not just Twitter, Facebook anymore either. We get a lot of traffic from surprising places. You'd be amazed at the number of people who will click through to an article off Pinterest. And Reddit is always a difficult platform to actively manage. I think it's pretty much designed for people to not be actively posting, or sorry, for news organizations to not be actively trying to mine for traffic. But you can do it much more passively in terms of the way that you write, the angle you cover certain stories that you think are going to interest the kind of readership on different platforms. So I'd say it's a lot less about, what thing we use, like social flow or anything else to post our stories on what time of day and the length of the tweet. And I think it starts much more at a base level of when we're looking at a story and we're considering angles, thinking about who do we think is going to be reading this particular thing? Is it going to be direct traffic? Is it going to be something that people are going to come across through Google? Is it going to be through something we think is going to do really well on Facebook? And starting from that perspective and then tailoring an article to that kind of interests is really the secret there, I think.
Wow, I love that approach with Reddit. In other words, not being that person who, just pushes their buttons the wrong way, but rather catering content to them when it makes sense, when it feels like a story that really could go somewhere on Reddit.
Yeah, and I mean on Reddit, I'm not embarrassed to say that it's also quite often a good place to stay on top of news from different angles. You have a lot of companies these days will make small changes because they want them to fly under the radar. So it'll be a change to a plan, a change to a terms and conditions that isn't advertised anywhere in a press release. And quite often the quickest way to spot that is through a really specific subreddit. So not the big ones, the defaults, but almost every tech company has a subreddit geared towards them, quite often towards a product specifically. And that can be an interesting place to go and listen to kind of individual reports from users. And quite often, I'll talk to people who are posting a complaint about this kind of bug or this kind of change to their plan. I'll talk to a few people I might know otherwise, and then I'll take that to a company, talk to the PR and say, a bunch of people have said that this is happening, can you confirm? And that's often quite a good way to get a story ahead of everyone else as well.
We're getting a follow-up question about Pinterest, and if you can talk a little bit about Pinterest and what you guys are doing over there.
We do almost nothing in terms of actively pushing Pinterest to get stories through. It's more just that we've discovered that there's a lot of people on Pinterest who apparently are BGR readers who will share our content and it'll get shared around there. And honestly, there isn't a specific strategy. It's more we keep a close eye on our traffic sources and we'll go see, when we see that we've got a lot of inbound traffic on one article from Pinterest, we'll go and find it and we'll see why it's been shared, what the comments are looking like, that kind of thing.
That's so fascinating. You think of Pinterest as, I don't know, clothing trends, definitely not tech news, but that's interesting. And how will tech media evolve over the next few years?
That's a that's a pretty open-ended question. I'm personally tempted to say something that goes against the trend, which is that it's a pivot away from video. There's lots of media companies who see video as the future only because of I think the ad revenue that it can bring in. But if you look at some of the other consumption data, Nielsen and Pew survey results about how younger demographics prefer to consume things, it's not in a lot of cases through video. People like to read their news. They like to get opinion. They like to get analysis. And I think you're going to see almost a move towards more marquee personalities on different sites. Writers and editors who readers know by name, and they'll go looking for their stories. That's a trend that's already starting to emerge, I think. As for tech media specifically, I think it's going to go with what big thing comes next. So right now, VR and AR is all the rage, especially with the release of iOS 11. But I think there's also self-driving cars is a beat that hasn't had as many dedicated reporters as I think it maybe deserves, not just in terms of the companies and the technology that's enabling self-driving cars, but then what that will do to the world we live in. So when I was working at Gizmodo, one of the editors who ran the site while I was there was really focused on how technology impacts people's lives rather than just the technology itself. And I think self-driving cars has a big potential to be a seismic shift in the way that cities are built, parking spaces, the time it takes people to travel around. And I think there's not a lot of coverage on that yet. It's still kind of Uber versus Waymo versus Lyft versus everyone else. And I think getting out of that specific focus and looking more the impacts on society in the same way that smartphones had a huge seismic impact on society is going to be a big part of the reporting going forwards.
Okay, so it was a big question and an even bigger answer.
I think self-driving cars is definitely my pet love. So if anyone listening has a self-driving car client, feel free to send over any information.
And if you're an aspiring blogger, now's the time to start your self-driving blog and let it blow up.
Absolutely.
And let's step back a sec. You mentioned that you are of the opinion that video isn't necessarily the future, or at least that there's some sort of ceiling to it. And wanted to ask you, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question, which is, video's exploding right now in a certain sense, in that it's not that it's exploding, it's that the socials are pushing it very heavily. YouTubers are growing and growing. Do you think there's a big, shall we say, a video bubble that is going to burst at some point? In other words, too much video content.
I think it's almost already bursting, at least the first round of it. You look at how hard Facebook was pushing publishers to have video on their platforms, and that started to tone down a little bit. And the same with Snapchat and the native content that they were trying to get on the platform. I think what people are starting to realize is that making good video is very expensive. It's a lot more expensive than having people writing things, that's for sure. And also taking something that I see among my colleagues and places I work all the time is people who are very good at writing and reporting are very often not good at going and being a talking head on video for a couple hours every week. So something's going to change there. I think either you're going to see a new breed of reporters and editors who are specifically geared towards just doing video on platforms, and I know there's already lots of video producers and that kind of thing, but I'm talking you're going to have the next generation of kind of big name tech bloggers and things. I think whether their chosen medium is video or writing is going to have a big impact on where the tech media goes in terms of video versus written. But I don't want to try and get to guessing on where advertising money trends are going to go, because that's definitely not my job. But just looking at that, there's been a lot of interest in Pew surveys and research data on how people like to consume their content, and something that stands out is that people do not like reading 2-minute subtitled stock footage videos of a new Kickstarter product versus a 200-word blog post of the same thing.
You mentioned in the beginning of this event that demographically speaking, you guys heavily skewed towards the 18 to 35-year-old demographic. Do you at all think about generations, for example, Generation Z consuming your media versus baby boomers and everyone in between?
I definitely wouldn't put that that focus on it at all. One thing I'm constantly interested in is the emails I get from readers, quite often people who are offering tips or feedback or something. Me personally working the wireless beat, and a lot of the stories I've published, I get countless people who have been unsatisfied customers from wireless companies writing to give me their horror stories. And something that stands out there is that it's not just 18 to 35-year-olds, and even of that, it's not just the 18-year-olds who are reading. It's less about the age demographic, and I think much more about what I was saying before, people who are interested in keeping up with the technology industry as a hobby and an interest, rather than just straight service journalism.
We have a follow-up question asking if wireless data from Africa or Nigeria specifically would be interesting.
I'm sure. I'm always happy to read pictures. If you go from my Twitter page, I think there's an email there that I'm always happy to receive pictures on. I guess one thing I did not mention is that email, despite the volume of it, is still, I think, the best way to get pictures. And I don't know of a single journalist that likes unsolicited Twitter pictures.
No one, not a single one. So stop doing that. Okay, well, that's really good to know. And speaking of your email, without objection, can we send that out to audience members after this event?
It's okay. More than public enough already, so.
Fair enough. It is more than public. And in the remaining time that we have, before we take a couple more follow-up questions, is there anything else you can share with us about BGR beyond the tech side of things? So meaning now you guys are in entertainment, lifestyle, well, science, which is sort of tech, but with your expansion into other verticals, can you just briefly walk us through those other verticals?
Sure. I think the biggest thing to bear in mind is that the approach of BGR and a lot of other tech blogs to the entertainment industry is not the same as the angle that's being taken by, or that has been taken by, publications that traditionally cover those at all. We come at things from two very different sides. It all kind of starts with the people who we know are our readers and the kind of things they're interested in, and then taking how that will apply to a different industry. So entertainment, we're big into the cord cutting services. I've done reviews of new streaming services. A lot of looking at the impact that streaming services are going to have on cable TV, and how that will change how people consume content. And then we also cover the, specifically new TV series, that kind of thing. But even then, a lot of the times it's looking at it from the perspective of how new tech companies entering the space, so like obviously Netflix being the biggest one with original content, is changing that industry. So there's a different angle to be had there. It's not just like we're opening up a new vertical and trying to be like Deadline Magazine 2.0. It's a very different angle that we have there with the expansion into new topics. And that's not new. I think big tech blogs have been doing that for the last 5 years at least. If you remember when The Verge launched, it was their strapline was the intersection of culture and technology. And I think that's pretty commonplace across the industry, is finding that tech angle, or the angle that the existing tech readership is interested in, and applying it to other things that those same readers are also interested in outside of technology.
So, for example, geeky articles about Game of Thrones?
Yeah, that would be an excellent example. No, it's definitely a fine balance, and it's a moving target in terms of what we cover, and the angle that we use to cover it. And a lot of that is just day to day looking at the feedback we get through traffic numbers, through reader comments, through just the feelings we have about new articles that are coming out, is refining our angle, refining our focus, and looking at what we are and are not going to cover on a daily basis.
We have a follow-up question about the pitches you're receiving on a daily basis. Are you reading those? Do you have time to, sort through those?
Not every pitch gets read. I will be the first to admit. Very often a well-structured subject line will tell me that an article is, or that a pitch is not going to be for me or for the site, and that's no fault of the pitch. If anything, I would say that you're more likely to be in my good books if you have a good subject line that tells me what it's going to be about, so that if it's not going to be relevant, I don't waste time trying to read it. After that, I would say comfortably the best pitches that I receive are the ones that are brief and to the point. From a writing perspective, I think a lot of people know the pyramid style that newspapers coined, and it applies, I think, just as well in PR and writing pitches. You need to put the most salient information at the top, and then the context for that further down. It doesn't need a big preamble. It doesn't need a big introduction. And even follow-up emails, I think there's a temptation to get kind of flowery with language and get creative with it, but quite often the best way to do it is just to be, kind of trying this one more time, just in case you missed it.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And then let's do one more follow-up, and I think we're done, as we're 4 minutes away from being. Chris, someone's asking how this is a long question. Basically, how do you guys prioritize which socials you're focused on? In other words, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera.
We actually have different people focused on different social sites for our team, so that we don't have to get too choosy with resources. But obviously, the most attention and the most work is going to go towards the social channels that provide the best results for us, which in this day and age I think is still quite often Facebook, Twitter, that kind of thing. And then yes, we also take into consideration things like Reddit, but Reddit in terms of a traffic source is much less of a constant thing and much more of occasionally something will get a big bump, and when the bump comes it's big, but it's not a constant presence feeding every story. So we'll put a system in place for a platform, and most of the times those don't require too much active management to keep running. So many things are automated these days. But when a new, when we decide we want to try and really make a different social platform work for us, we'll spend a lot more time thinking about how we're going to approach it, and then try and put into place something that's simple to keep running day to day.
Chris, looks like we're out of time. I can't thank you enough on behalf of everyone, both listening live as well as the recording later on, but just want to thank you for taking a few moments out of your very busy schedule to provide all of this valuable feedback and insight.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a nice afternoon.